All right. Timothy Weiss is an anti-racism speaker, activist, and writer who attended Hillsborough High School and then went on to attend Tulane University, where he was a leader in the campus anti-apartheid movement. After college, Mr. Weiss began a career in the field of activism for many years in New Orleans, where he eventually became the Associate Director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. He gained a national reputation in defending affirmative action in the late 1990s and has spoken across the nation at over 300 colleges, including Vanderbilt's Tearing Down the Walls conference this past year. He has also appeared on MSNBC Live and ABC's 2020. His speech this evening is titled Beyond Diversity, Promoting Racial Equity in a Deeply Divided America. Please join me in welcoming Tim Weiss to MBA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to do a couple things. First, I want to obviously thank Bryson and all the folks at MBA that made it possible for me to come literally down the road. I live about a half a mile from here, so this was a very easy trip for me, which is nice compared to having to run all over the country to give these talks. Secondly, I want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time because I want to be able to engage with you a little bit. But I want to start off by sharing a couple of stories, and they're maybe not going to seem that they're connected or related, but I think you'll see when I'm done that they are. For those of you who were at I know a few of you probably were at the Tearing Down the Walls conference, one of these stories I know that I told, I'm not sure about the other one, but it bears repeating and trying to connect these two to sort of frame my remarks this evening. The first has to do with a very personal family experience that helped to shape, and a family member who helped to shape who I am, talking specifically about my paternal grandmother. I grew up in Nashville, as did my parents, as did my grandparents for the most part. And my dad's mom was sort of this extraordinary figure in my life, someone who was extraordinary and important to me on a lot of levels. Number one, because it was to her house and the house of my grandfather that I would usually turn when things got a little too hectic in my home, which happens. You know, we all sort of come from dysfunction. Most of us won't acknowledge it. I'm 51 years old and in therapy, so I can acknowledge it to you, and my therapist told me it was therapeutic to do that wherever I go, so there it is. And when you grow up in a hectic, sort of drama-filled home, as I did, having a place to go to, having a refuge is really helpful. And so I did that, and I was able to go to my grandparents' house to get away from some of the chaos. So she was important in that regard, literally keeping me alive, I think, in some regards. But also beyond that, she was important as sort of a role model on issues of race. This was someone who, even though she wasn't an activist by any stretch of the imagination, was someone who nonetheless had been strongly committed to fighting racism her entire life, going back to the time that she was 16 years old, at which point she fell in love with the man who would become my grandfather, who was Jewish. And the problem with that was that her father, my great-grandfather, happened to be a member of the Klan. And so as you can imagine, falling in love with a Jewish guy when your daddy is a Klansman usually doesn't go over very well at the cross burning, right? So she had to go to him and decide how she was going to address this with her own father. And this was 1936, so she was 16 years old. And she went to her dad at a time when Southern white girls did not speak to their daddies this way, and told him, number one, that she had fallen in love with a Jew, number two, that she was appalled by his racism against black folks, and number three, that she was going to give him two choices that evening. The first choice was that he was going to take his Klan robes and his Klan hood, and he was going to take them out of the closet, take them into the front yard, and he was going to burn them on the lawn that night. Or the second option was that she was going to take his Klan robes and his Klan hood into the front yard, and she was going to burn them that evening. And my great-grandfather, challenged that day by this sort of, 16-year-old freedom fighter, again, imagine this, in 1936, did as he was instructed. He went to his closet, he took the robes, he took them into the front yard, he burned them, he quit the Klan the next day, and he accepted the man who would eventually become my grandfather into his life. Now you can imagine, having made this stand against her own father in 1936, my grandmother then decides, God, this fighting racism thing is sort of easy, right? Because it went so well the first time she decided to do it, that all throughout her life she would continue to do this. So 20 some odd years later, when she and my grandfather were looking for a new house in the late 1950s, mid to late 50s, she was looking at a house, and a real estate agent made the mistake. He didn't know that it was a mistake, but it turned out to be a horrible mistake on his part. Didn't know it. He said to my grandmother and grandfather, "You're going to like this neighborhood. There are no black people here." And needless to say, he did not use the term black people. It was at this point that my grandmother looked at the real estate agent and said, "I am going to give you two choices today," because my grandmother was clearly a fan of the multiple choice test and always wanted to give the racist an out, right? And so she said, "Your first option is you're going to get in your car and you're going to drive your ass out of here. Or number two choice, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to run your ass over," right? And he got in his car and he left, again, did as he was instructed. And once again, my grandmother got the impression that in spite of how frightening it might be to challenge racism, certainly in the 30s and even in the 50s, that at least as far as she was concerned, she knew she had a moral obligation to do it. And these were lessons that were handed down to her own kids, ultimately handed down to her grandchildren, of which I was the first of 5. So in many ways, she was a critical role model in my life. But the important part of the story is not that. The important part of the story is what happened in the latter years of her life, because I don't come here just to praise a woman who's now been dead for 21 years, no point in that. What I do want to tell you is a much deeper story, though, because it's relevant to the conversation that I want us to have and that I think we as a country need to have. Because see, in the last 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years of her life, maybe a little bit longer, she was suffering from Alzheimer's and ultimately would succumb to that disease. It would be the disease that would ultimately take her from us at the age of 78. And in the last couple of years, now if you know anyone who's had the disease, before I get into the trajectory of it in her life, you know that the lost memory is like, that's the symptom we know about. That's what we associate with Alzheimer's, right? But that's actually the most benign symptom. Right? And to be perfectly honest with you, in a weird kind of way, and this won't make sense to you if you haven't experienced it, but at least in my experience, there's something almost strangely romantic and beautiful about the loss of memory. It's bizarre. I know it's awfully frustrating for the family members, but there's something incredible about watching someone literally retrogress to an infant state. It's frightening, it's disturbing, it's scary, but it was also quite romantic in a strange way. So the loss of memory is the least of the problems that you have when you're caring for someone with that disease or any form of dementia. The worst part is the anger and the hostility and the rage and the paranoia, because when you're losing your mind, there's part of your mind that knows you're losing it, right? There's part of you that knows that you're slipping, that you don't remember who your own children are, that you can't remember what day it is, you can't remember who the president is, you can't remember what year it is, sometimes you don't know where you are, and you can imagine that's scary, and when you're scared, you're usually not on your best behavior, right? And so you'll lash out at people. You'll lash out at your own kids, you'll lash out at your grandkids, and you will lash out at the caregivers who were taking care of you and literally keeping you alive. Well, it just so happens that in the last 2 years of my grandmother's life, the women who were keeping her alive, reminding her to take her meds, right? Feeding her, making sure she didn't burn the house down because she had a bad habit of smoking cigarettes, falling asleep, and dropping the cigarettes on the floor, just like out of her mouth when she would fall asleep. So they would try to keep an eye on her, make sure that she didn't die. The women who were doing that were, for those last 2 years, all of them black women. Now, remember what I just told you, right? When you're going through the stages of this disease, you're lashing out at people, you're angry, you're hostile, you're not on your best behavior. I would ask you to imagine what you think my grandmother, in her moments of weakness and insecurity and fear and anger, what did she call the black women who were taking care of her, keeping in mind who I told you my grandmother was? In terms of her feelings about race and racism. Keeping in mind that I told you that since the age of 16, she had stood strong against racism, and yet now being cared for by black women, what word do you think she used to describe them when the chips were down? And of course, I'm not going to say it. I don't have to. I'm sure you can imagine. Keeping in mind what I just told you about her. What does that mean? What does it mean that that word would be one of the last words that I would hear her speak before she stopped talking at all? What does it mean that even when she couldn't remember who her husband had been, couldn't remember her own children or grandchildren's names, couldn't remember how to feed herself or to give herself her medication or to clean herself after going to the bathroom, never forgot the word you use when you want to attack black people in this country and when the chips are down and you're afraid? It's sort of deep that you would remember that when you literally don't remember anything else. Right? Now, that's not a story about Alzheimer's, by the way. It's not a story about that at all. It doesn't take Alzheimer's to make us scared or angry or insecure, right? Most of us go through those kinds of emotions just through the normal course of living. We have our better and our worst days. And I guess my point is, if a woman like that, who had stood strong against racism for all those years, could retrogress back to her conditioning, what does that tell us? It tells us that we're all vulnerable. Right? It tells us that in a way we can all sort of retrogress back to what we've been taught, and you don't need a Klan parent to teach you racism. You don't need a Klan parent to teach you racial stereotypes or racial bias or to look down on racial others. The culture itself does that, whether or not you have a Klansman in your family. And so in a very significant way, my grandmother was a product of her learning. When she was healthy, she could resist. Right? When she was healthy, she could make the choice to fight the conditioning, which is fantastic. That's the good news. But when we're weakened, whether it's by a disease that takes our mind or whether it's just by other conditions and experiences that we're undergoing, right, we can sometimes not be our best selves. And if that could happen to her, I have to know that it could happen to me and that it could happen to any of us. The point of me telling you that story is, number one, we can't be ever too confident that we're really anti-racist, that we're really sort of woke enough to not have to worry about these issues, right, because it's part of all of our conditioning. And secondly, the fact that we're products of our learning is itself an important lesson, and I'll come back to it in a second, right? Here's the second story that indicates how we're products of our learning. And I told this story at the Tearing Down the Walls conference, but it bears repeating. I'll go through it a little quicker than I did before. A couple years ago, my daughters and I, so I have two teenage daughters. They both go to USN. One's a senior, one's a sophomore, and they're both dancers, and they've been dancers for many years, since they were little kids. And so this particular time, this is like when they were 12 and 10, they were dancing in a particular company where they'd been dancing at that point for many, many years, and it's a company that was located downtown. So we would every day or 3 days a week, we would drive from USN to the studio downtown on 3rd Avenue, and or actually on 2nd Avenue. And to get there, we would usually just go surface roads through Edge Hill, through the back way, down around back behind the old Sound Stadium, and we'd come out downtown. But rarely, would we get on the interstate every now and then, but usually just surface roads. So on this particular day, we're driving, and we get about halfway between USN and the studio, and that's right in the middle of the Edge Hill public housing community, which is at the light that is at 12th Avenue and Edge Hill. And we're sitting there at the light, and we're waiting for it to turn green. And it's a light that we have been stopped at, I am certain, probably 24 times at that point. But on this particular day, my youngest daughter, Rachel, decided to comment on the sort of the neighborhood and the racial demographic of the neighborhood, which I'm sure she had noticed before, but she'd never commented about it before. So she looks around, and she says, while we're waiting for the light to turn green, she says, "Daddy, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black?" Right? And I thought, well, that is a really good question, right? Why is this particular neighborhood pretty much all black? I was on the one hand sort of excited, like my 10-year-old is doing urban anthropology in the back of my Highlander, so in and of itself that's relatively impressive, right? But more importantly, it's like, as someone who does civil rights and anti-racism work, I'm thinking that is like the one question my kid could ask me that I actually know the answer to, right? Like if they had asked me a science-related question, I did not pay attention in class, right? If they asked me, where does electricity come from? I'm gonna be like, you got a phone? You can Google it, right? I'm sure they taught you that at USN. They didn't clearly teach me that at Hillsborough, or I just didn't pay attention. But whatever the case, you can look that up. But she asked me a question about race. She asked me a question about the racial composition of a neighborhood, and that's something that Dad actually does know, because that's what I study. So I thought, okay, good, I'm gonna get to show off how smart I am to my children, which is great, because when you're a parent, you will take victories wherever you can find them. And so I decided I was going to take mine, right? And so I was ready with the answer. Now, I couldn't give the PhD level answer to my kid's question, why it was that Edge Hill was overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, a black community. I couldn't give the PhD explanation for several reasons. Number one, I do not have a PhD. Number two, they are 10 and 12 and cannot handle the PhD answer. And number three, we got like 4 minutes before we're gonna be at the dance studio. So I've gotta give like the short elevator speech version of race demographics in Nashville. And so I'm ready with the answer, and then something happened that I didn't know was going to happen because I'm an only child. But I learned that day that when a younger sibling asks a question in the presence of an older sibling to a parent, the older sibling will inevitably just answer the question themselves just to show off how much smarter they are than their younger, in this case, sister. And so here was Dad ready with the explanation for how the neighborhood became pretty much all black. And the 12-year-old, whose name is Ashton, she jumps in and she says, redlining. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, how do you know that term? Now, if you don't know the meaning of the term, I'll explain it to you in a second. Let it suffice to say the 10-year-old says, I don't know what redlining is. I said, yeah, I don't think your sister knows what redlining is either, but it was a really good guess. Actually, it's not quite true, though, right? Redlining isn't how the neighborhood got black. It is how the neighborhood got poor and stayed poor, because redlining is a term that describes something banks used to do just as a matter of course. It used to actually be legal. Now it's not. It still happens indirectly, but for many, many years it was a perfectly legal above-board practice where banks would put maps on the wall, they would draw around black neighborhoods with red lines, with magic markers that were red, and anybody who lived within the boundaries of the red line would not be able to get a loan from the bank. It didn't matter if you had good credit, didn't matter if you had a college degree, didn't matter what your job prospects or your occupation were, you just weren't going to get a loan. So that is how urban spaces were starved of capital. That's not how they became black, but I'm thinking, you know, my kid's 12, I'm going to give her like half credit, we'll retake the test when she's 15. Like, it's all right. It's a decent guess to start with. It suggests that she's paying some attention, and it at least proves that she knows there's something going on socially and systemically that has produced this outcome. So I had like 4 minutes to get to the studio. I give them the brief thumbnail sketch of how the neighborhood became black. First, I noted that in Edge Hill and all public housing communities in the United States, with very few exceptions, these public housing communities were constructed not for people of color, they were constructed for white folks. They were actually built for working class white folks in the earliest years of the Depression, and in fact, black and brown folks weren't even allowed to live in public housing for the first several years of their existence in most cities. So it was for poor white folks to get a leg up, and then what happened is the government created something in addition to that. They created the FHA loan program, later the VA loan program, later the GI Bill. Theoretically, these were open to everyone, or at least veterans in the case of the VA and the GI Bill. But in practice, people of color were just routinely excluded from these things. Even if they were GIs, they were not given the same terms, they were not given the same quality of benefits. And black folks generally could not access, in almost any cases, the FHA loans, which were government underwritten, government guaranteed, government backed, in effect subsidized loans, which allowed millions of white families to leave the cities where they had been living and move to the suburbs where only we were allowed to live. So in a way, the reason that Edge Hill and other communities like that, the one that we're in, but others as well, became so racially specific was because of an opportunity structure that literally subsidized white flight and kept black and brown folks at that time, black folks specifically, locked into certain communities where they would then be redlined, unable to access capital, and thus the neighborhood would remain poor. So I finished that thumbnail sketch, elevator speech version of American history and housing. I dropped the kids off at the studio, and as I was pulling away, well, first I asked them if it made sense to them, and they were appropriately horrified, so I felt I had done my job. Right? And as I'm pulling away, I'm feeling sort of self-satisfied about that until I realized, right, the danger in the question. It wasn't that that interaction hadn't gone well, that interaction had. My kids now understood something that frankly a lot of 10 and 12-year-olds probably wouldn't. My concern was, what happens when other children ask their parents that question and the parents don't know the history? Because after all, why would most parents know that history? I mean, I guess maybe most black parents in Nashville and other parts of the country where the story is the same might know that history because they lived it. So there might be some lived experience, right? But for white parents in America, why would we know the history of race-based and class-based discrimination in housing? Because it's not really our story for the most part. And we don't learn that for the most part in school. I mean, I took AP history, they didn't teach us that. Right? That's supposedly the history for the smart folks, but they apparently didn't think we were capable of handling that kind of material. So for the most part, we don't learn it. And you can't teach what you don't know, right? So if you're a parent and your kid wants to know, why does this neighborhood look like this and this neighborhood look like this, and you've never been taught the answer to that, and you haven't had parents who have filled you in, and you haven't had teachers who filled you in, then what's going to happen? And that was when it really came sort of over me, the fear of what I knew would happen, right? Because if you think about it, there's only one possible conclusion that a kid can reach if you don't give them that history, if you don't give them the context behind all the stuff that they're seeing. And what is that conclusion? There's only one possible. It's the default position of American culture, right? It's the default position based on the one thing that we're all taught in common, regardless of race, class, regardless of cultural background, geographic background, religious background. The one thing we're all taught in this country, right, is that wherever you end up in America is all about you, because anybody can make it here, right? So if you teach people that you can make it, anybody can make it in America, and there are no obstacles to your success, and wherever you end up is all about you, when certain people wind up on the bottom of a class structure and a race structure, we could also say on a gender structure. So if men are disproportionately at the top of that structure and women are at the bottom disproportionately, if white folks are disproportionately up here and people of color disproportionately here, if rich folks are here and poor are here, it becomes almost logical in a sick, kind of twisted way, right, for people to then assume that the people up here just must be better. After all, that's why they're there. And the people down here must have something wrong with them, culturally, maybe even biologically, and that's why they are down here. So in a weird way, racism, classism, sexism, these all become like default positions if you haven't been given the sociological imagination, which is what sociologists call it, right? This ability to sort of understand what came before whatever it is you're seeing right now. And the fact of the matter is that also demonstrates, just like the story about my grandmother, that we're all products of our learning. In the case of my grandmother, she was a product of her conditioning around racism, both by her father but also by the society in which she was raised. And you're also a product of your learning in terms of what you're not taught. If you're not taught certain things, it will also affect the way that you understand the world, right? So if you're taught racism at the knee of your parent or by the larger society, it will affect you. And to some extent, the research says it affects all of us. We don't want to admit that. Right? We want to draw a line that says we're the good people and those are the bad people. So as I said today during the assembly, right, we want to draw a line that says those boys in Charlottesville in 2017, they're the problem, or the Klan is the problem, or the neo-Nazis are the problem, or David Duke is the problem, or the president is the problem, or whoever it is, ignoring the fact that we've all been conditioned to fall prey to these same biases. Now, we don't all do it to the same degree. Right? Obviously, white supremacists and neo-Nazis are taking it to a much different place than most folks do, but we've all been exposed to the same conditioning, and advertising works, whether you're trying to sell folks toilet paper, toothpaste, or racial stereotypes, right? If you hear a stereotype enough, it will affect you. There's a whole body of research in the world of marketing, for instance, which finds that when you see an advertisement 12 times for a product, that's the sort of magical moment at which you become exponentially more likely to buy the product, right? The first few times you see an ad doesn't really affect you, right? You get to like the 10th time that you've seen an ad, and all of a sudden you're paying more attention to the ad, according to the research. And by the time you get to 12, that's when you're like, oh man, I really need to try that Angel Soft toilet paper because I think it might be better than Charmin. You know, they keep telling me it's better, or they keep telling me to switch to Colgate instead of Crest, and maybe I'm gonna try that. Well, if I can make you change your consumer preferences based on 12 ads, think about how much easier it is to get you to buy into racial stereotypes or religious stereotypes or gender stereotypes or class stereotypes. You've seen all of those a lot more than 12 times. Right? You've been exposed to those more than 12 times, hundreds of times. So to think that somehow we escape that conditioning is nonsensical. And just in case you need proof of it, look, there have been studies on this. One took a group of white Americans who were all very, I guess, liberal. I don't mean politically liberal. I just mean sort of like open-minded, and certainly considered themselves to not be racist, right? If you asked them, they'd, oh my gosh, no, I'm not racist. And they actually gave them like a test to test for overt racism, and they all passed with flying colors, none of them overt racist. Then they took these nice white liberal people and they hooked them up to brain scan imaging machines, right, in a laboratory experiment, and they started flashing images on a computer screen that was sitting in front of them while they were wired to the brain scan imaging machines. And these images were being flashed so quickly that you wouldn't even be able to know what it is you saw. It was like a subliminal image, which, for the handful of folks old enough to remember this in the room, used to do this in movies, right? up through the 1960s. They would put subliminal words on a few of the frames in a movie, like if you went to the movie theater and all of a sudden they would flash the word popcorn, or they would flash the word candy, and you wouldn't even know it had happened, but all of a sudden your subconscious brain saw something. Your conscious brain did not. All of a sudden everybody's heading out to the concession stand. They have no idea why they're doing it, right? This ultimately was stopped because I guess it's like unethical or something, right? And so they don't do that anymore, at least theoretically. I don't know how we'd know actually if they do it, but in this particular experiment, they had these nice white liberal people hooked up to brain imaging machines, and they start flashing images like 80 milliseconds. Again, not enough for your conscious mind to even know what it saw, but enough for your subconscious mind to know that it saw something and for it to register at that level. And the images they were flashing, some of them, had no effect. The brain activity didn't really light up. No part of the brain really lit up. It would be images like a little puppy dog or a beach ball or an ice cream cone or whatever. It didn't really provoke much brain activity. Then they flashed an image of a black male face, right, for like 80 milliseconds or whatever it was, 100 milliseconds, whatever it was. And the first thing that happened was, first, the part of the brain that responds to fear lit up. And then almost immediately after that, the part of the brain that controls executive function, which is essentially the part of our brain that tries to overrule irrationality, right? That if we're doing something irrational, it tries to sort of, swoop in and bring us back to a steady state of rationality. All of a sudden that lit up. Now, there's only really one way to interpret these results, right? First, the fact that the part of the brain that responds to fear lit up first when it saw a black male face, but never had that reaction to any other image that was flashed, including the images of white male faces, suggests that even these nice white liberal people, quote unquote, had still been conditioned to respond, not even to a real black man. This is just a guy on a screen. This is like literally a face on a screen, not in the room, and yet there's still something subconscious that is being triggered. And then in the case of these individuals, because they are quote unquote liberal and think of themselves as anti-racist, that executive function takes over, right? Because that's like part of the brain saying, oh, I'm not supposed to think that, I'm not supposed to think that, I'm not supposed to think. And they're not even experiencing this consciously. They don't even know they're having this reaction, but the brain scan imaging technology is showing us that there is a response, even among people who are not outwardly biased. Now, good for them. The executive part of their brain is trying to conquer the irrational part, but the point is, it's having to do that work, because the irrational part got triggered first. So what does that tell us? Just like the story about my grandmother, right? It tells us that all of us, even when we have a commitment to doing the right thing, we can easily be steered in the direction of doing the wrong thing. So that should be humbling to the point where we acknowledge that none of us are completely free of this conditioning, right? The second piece, of course, is if you're not taught the historical context about the society in which we live, in the case of the story about my children, for instance, and redlining and the racialization of community, then you will rationalize inequality. You'll rationalize disparities in wealth, as I mentioned today in the assembly, that the typical sort of midpoint white family in this country has about 12 times the net worth of the typical midpoint African American family, about 10 times that of the typical Latinx family. And it's certainly not because we've worked harder historically. It's not because we've prayed harder. It's not because we possess some superior investment strategies. I mean, the recession in 2009 was caused mostly by a lot of really smart, really well-educated, high IQ, high SAT having white boys on Wall Street, and they destroyed the economy. It weren't black folks in that mix, weren't brown folks in that mix, no immigrants documented or otherwise, just a bunch of guys with, MBAs and really high MCAT scores who basically either stole or lost 20% of the accumulated net worth of the United States in like 18 months. So it's clearly not the case that white folks are inherently superior at investing money, and that's why we have more wealth. There's a history here, right? There's a history whereby some people were able to accumulate wealth and then pass that down in a disproportionate manner, and others were disproportionately unable to do that. But if I don't know that history, because we don't talk about it, because we don't want to talk about it, or we want to leave the past in the past, at least some of the past. Like I said today in the assembly, we don't leave all the past in the past. We don't leave the July 4th celebration in the past, right? I remember growing up and you'd hear things like, remember the Alamo. Why? That's a really old thing, right? Like, remember Pearl Harbor. But why, old man? Like, why don't we just forget about that, Because we want to remember certain things. We want to remember the things that venerate us, the things that make us feel more patriotic. We don't want to remember the stuff that brings us up short, though, the stuff that actually makes us question our commitment to our professed values. And so we avoid these conversations. We don't want to talk about the reasons for disparities in the justice system, the war on drugs, for instance. We know that white folks use drugs, possess drugs, sell drugs at rates that are essentially the exact same as the rates for black and brown folks, but depending on the state, they're anywhere from 5 to 9 times more likely to be arrested and incarcerated on a drug offense if you're black or brown. So clearly, something is happening. There's a history behind it. There's ongoing discrimination. But if we don't interrogate that, and if we don't talk about that because we're trying to avoid controversy or trying to avoid upsetting folks, then we're never going to understand the source of our current inequalities, and we're going to try to rationalize them and say the people down here, they just deserve what they get, and the people up here deserve what they get. It also makes it hard for us to resolve our current political disputes if we don't learn the right history, if we're not clear about the context for the things that we see today. Think about the biggest issues that sort of divide us right now in this country, at least a couple of them. If you think about the debates currently around the issue of policing, going back to that subject just for a second, right? The reason that so many white Americans seem to get defensive about a very simple slogan like Black Lives Matter and a movement known as the Movement for Black Lives is because we don't really have a history, a historical grounding in the way that law enforcement has reacted and acted within communities of color. Which is why we'll respond to the cry Black Lives Matter by saying things like, well, what about all lives? And what about our lives? And what about white lives? Well, of course, white lives matter as well. The difference is cops already know that. Right? And teachers already know that, and employers already know that, and bank loan officers already know that, and the folks that, you know, are at the mall and in the shopping center, they know that when my daughters are walking around. Nobody questions whether they're going to shoplift. Nobody's thinking about whether their lives matter or not or what they're up to. They are presumed to matter. Right? You have to say Black Lives Matter precisely because black lives have been discounted. You have to specify the thing that's been left out. You don't have to say all. We've always said all. We didn't mean it. Right? Thomas Jefferson said all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but he owned 230-something people when he wrote it. So at some level, he didn't really believe it fully, even though they were very nice words, and they're important words to remember, but there was a contradiction between the reality and the rhetoric, and so we can say all and not really mean all until all includes black and brown folks. We're going to have to be more specific about including people in that. It's the reason we have Black History Month and not White History Month, right? Because we got a bunch of White History Months. They just go by tricky names like May and June and July and August, and pretty much every other month that we haven't specified for a different group, that's going to be a month that we're going to learn about a lot of white people, and we don't have to call it that because it's just a default position. It's taken for granted, right? But again, this slogan of Black Lives Matter wouldn't be controversial if we really understood the history of policing. Right? Black folks know this history. Black folks know that policing, and this isn't about saying every cop is bad or every cop's a bigot or every cop is brutal. It's about the institution of policing, right? An institution that can take even really good cops and twist them and change the way that they act on the street so as to fit in with the culture, right? A lot of people get into policing for the right reasons, right? But the longer you stay in an institution that's predicated on domination and control, right, and having a certain type of public-facing attitude toward the communities that you police, the more likely it's going to change you. And actually, there have been several officers who have talked about this coming out of Baltimore in particular, a couple of white officers several years ago that right in the middle of the uprising in Baltimore after Freddie Gray was killed in police custody, these were white guys who came out and said when they tried to speak out against brutality in the Baltimore Police Department, when they tried to speak out about the framing of black suspects in the Baltimore Police Department, they were sidelined, they were given bad assignments, they were given desk duty, they were sent out on calls alone, which is incredibly dangerous, right? When they would call for backup, nobody would come, right? This was a way of sort of telling these officers, you're supposed to toe the line, you're not supposed to speak out, you're not supposed to challenge our practices. What were they going to do? Ultimately, they left policing because they knew that they would be in danger or that their careers would be essentially sidelined if they tried to move up within the ranks. So they ended up leaving the force because they were forced out by the institution itself. So there are plenty of good cops. The question is the institution of policing, right, has this corrupting effect, and that's because of its history. The institution of policing is the institution that enforced the black codes after the Civil War. It is the institution that enforced segregation laws. It is the institution that pulled protesters off of the sit-in stools downtown in this city and in other cities throughout the South. And it's been cops who have enforced the war on drugs. So it makes sense that black and brown folks would be suspicious of and a little cynical about the institution of law enforcement. If we were, as white folks, to learn that history, then it wouldn't be so strange to see black folks demanding equal justice in the streets of this country. But if we haven't learned that history, it seems sort of threatening, or it seems separatist to us, or it seems militant, when really it's just sort of common sense. Same thing with immigration. Right? Think about the divisions over immigration, which are probably some of the biggest in the country right now. The only reason this is so divisive is, once again, that we haven't really learned the history accurately about how we got here. And when I say we now, I'm talking about people of European descent, because black folk know how they got here. And indigenous people know how they were here first. And even a lot of Chicanx folks know that their families lived in what we now call the American Southwest long before Europeans showed up. At least the indigenous portion of Chicanx peoples lived on this land for a long time. Asian Americans know that many of them were brought here to work and help build the railroads that made the transcontinental economy possible. But those of us of European descent have been lying to ourselves in a lot of ways for a long time, right? And we know that we've been lying, not all of us, but an awful lot of us, because when the president can start his campaign as he did, you remember what the president said when he launched his campaign? He said, Mexico isn't sending their best, right? Now, do you actually think England sent their best? Just a quick pop quiz. Do you think the best of England are the ones that came, or the best of Scotland, or the best of Ireland, or the best of Russia? Nobody sends their best. The best never leave, y'all. Right? The best don't get on the boat. Why would the winners get on the boat? The winners are not going to leave, they're winning. Winning feels good. You stay put when you're winning, right? And so the winners stayed there. The losers are the ones who left. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong. In fact, there's something beautiful about it, right? Actually saying, I'm tired of being economically marginalized, or I'm tired of being politically repressed, or I'm tired of the pogroms in Russia, which was the case for the Jewish side of my family, 1/4 of my family that came from Russia in the early 20th century, right? There's something beautiful about saying, I'm tired of losing, and I'm going to start over. The difference is, though, we don't see how similar that story is to the story of people coming from Honduras and Mexico and Guatemala or Sri Lanka or anywhere on the continent of Africa, right? We draw a line and we say, well, our people came legally the right way, but what does that even mean? There weren't any laws to break, right? If there are no laws on the books and then your family doesn't break them, again, no laws on the books, you don't get patted on the back for being law-abiding, for not breaking a law that didn't even exist yet. That's not how that works, right? And I can assure you that if Russia and Scotland, the two places that my family mostly comes from, had been right next door to the United States, so that it would be as easy as just crossing a border, not that that's easy, but I guess spatially it's easier than crossing an ocean, right? If Russia and Scotland had been right next door, I know that my family would have come. Like my great-grandparents or great-great-great-great-great-grandparents wouldn't have looked at it and said, well, you know, the kids are starving and we're probably not going to live another year, but I wouldn't want to break the laws of the United States of America, so I'll just stay put. Nobody would do that, right? You would make the same choice, but we fail to see ourselves in those immigrants and to see that their stories are very similar to our stories. And in doing that, we deepen this divide between us and them in a way that makes it really hard to move forward as a country, because we're looking at newcomers and saying, well, they're coming for the wrong reasons. They're coming for stuff, and we came for freedom. But we didn't really come for freedom. We came for stuff, like land, like opportunity. That's stuff. I mean, stuff can be connected to freedom, but it's not like we were just coming on principle. Right? We came because we wanted to breathe freely. We came because we wanted land that we couldn't acquire elsewhere. We came because we were starving in the places whence we come, right? And so we felt we had to leave. The idea that we came for principles, all one has to do is look at the colonies of what became the United States. They weren't particularly free places, right? Not only for indigenous people and not only for black folks, but even for the wrong kind of Christians, right? The colonies were places of intense unfreedom if you prayed the wrong way, right? They spent much of their time looking for the witch. That's not exactly an exemplar of freedom and liberty loving, right? And so in a sense, if we had a deeper and more accurate understanding of our own journey, we would be a lot more ecumenical towards those who were trying to come now. We would realize nobody really wants to leave where they're from. Our people didn't. You think that Europeans really wanted to leave? No, they would have loved to be able to stay and make it where they were. Nobody likes moving, right? My wife and I built a new house over here in Sylvan Park. It is 3 blocks from our old house in Sylvan Park. We built it in 2013. It is 3 blocks. We didn't even change postal codes. We didn't change mail delivery people. We live in functionally the same neighborhood, and moving 3 blocks damn near killed me, right? I looked at my wife and we were done. I'm like, that's it. Never moving again. If we have grandchildren, they're coming here. I don't ever want to leave. I hated this experience. I'm never moving again, because moving isn't fun. Nobody likes to do it. Now imagine if it's not fun to move 3 blocks, right? Then imagine how much more difficult it is to move not just 3 blocks, not just 3 cities or states away, but an entire country or an entire continent away in some cases, just to find opportunity, leaving everybody you know, everything you know behind. Nobody would do that just for fun. Nobody would do that because they had nothing better to do on a Wednesday. Nobody would do that just to take advantage of the magnanimous healthcare system of the United States, right? Nobody is going to do that just to take advantage. You're only going to do that when you're desperate. And if we could understand the desperation that drove us, we could understand the desperation that drives them. But you know what we do? We all get on Ancestry.com. Right? Because those commercials entice us, right? So we get on there. And let's be honest, like when we're on Ancestry, we're not looking for like the peasants in our family, right? We're not looking for like the working class heroes that stood up to the elite. I mean, I'm looking for that, but that's just me. Like most of the time when that little leaf starts to spin, like if you've ever been on there, you know what we're looking for. We're looking for kings and queens and barons and dukes and royalty and stuff, even though those might have been horrible human beings. But we're looking for like the ruling class, and if we don't find them, we actually get despondent. Like when the leaves stop spinning and you can't trace it back anymore, which usually means you've hit a peasant, right? Because if you just had royalties, you'd be going all the way back in royal families, as far back as you could go. When you hit that end of the road, you found a peasant, and you feel sort of like, right? Because we've all been encouraged to sort of aspire to this ruling class history rather than embracing the fact that most of us come from pretty modest roots. That's why it's so fascinating when people talk about their family coming on the Mayflower. It's like, do you have any idea who was on that ship and the other early ships? Like it was not the king. It was not anybody the king particularly wanted to keep around. Like it was a lot of people who weren't the winners in their respective societies. And again, nothing wrong with that. The problem is when we don't acknowledge that, and then we create this artificial divide between ourselves and others. And even at the more basic level, and we have to have this conversation, as difficult as it can be to have it. You know, it's one thing, I think, to have conservative beliefs politically and ideologically, and that's fine. I think reasonable people can disagree about a lot of subjects, even the ones that I've been talking about, and have good, honest, intellectual, scholarly debates where we can respect each other's views. But there is something that concerns me when conservatism takes on this sort of patina of historical nostalgia that it has taken on currently, right? It's one thing to be conservative. In fact, it's one thing to actually support Donald Trump and the presidency of Donald Trump. It's quite another to sort of gleefully put on a hat that says, "Make America Great Again," without any sense of misgiving as to what that message actually says to millions of people in this country. I think you could be a conservative without putting on that hat. I think you can vote for Donald Trump without putting on that hat. I don't know if people do, but they certainly could, right? There's no reason we have to embrace this nostalgia, but when you say, as this slogan does and as this movement does, "Make America Great Again," what you're saying, whether you mean to offend or not, right, is you're saying that in a way, I don't care about certain people's past, because there's no way to suggest that black folks ever had it great in this country, right, in the past. There's no way to suggest that poor people have ever had it great. When children were working in mines and factories, they certainly didn't have it great. LGBTQ folk never had it great. Religious minorities never had it great. Women, as women, didn't have it great, right? The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1972 when I was 4 years old. And what did that act do? It was the first law passed that actually made it possible in many cases for women to get loans from banks in their own name. You used to have to get loans either through your husband or through your father or some other man who would vouch for you. So really, to suggest that America was ever great and we want to go back to that, that only makes sense for a very narrow sliver of Americans, right? For the vast majority of Americans, that kind of nostalgia is very dangerous. And it seems to me that, once again, that's about a lack of historical memory. We're all products of what we learn, and we're products of what we don't learn, which is one of the reasons that I think in our educational system, as much as we obviously want to have an emphasis on, as you know, STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math, I would say we need to supplement that, right, with what I call mesh education. M for media literacy, right, to help us discern truth from fiction, because we're constantly being bombarded, not just within news media, but even commercial media, with images on the part of, advertisers that want to sell us stuff. It's really important for young people to be able to discern fact from fiction and discern propaganda, public or private, from reality, right? So M for media literacy, E for ethics, right? How many of us really have indulged in ethical debates? Maybe at a school like MBA you do, and some of the better independent schools around the country and public schools might engage in those things, but for the most part, you can go your whole life and never have a conversation about ethical dilemmas that we face in this country and on the planet as a whole right now, unless you maybe engage those in a philosophy class in college, or maybe in a place of worship, you might have certain conversations about that. That's not enough. We need to be engaged around ethical conversations. S in mesh for sociology, right? Understanding sociology, meaning the interplay between groups of people and the power dynamics between groups of people. Because going back to the example with my daughters in the car, if you don't understand those power dynamics, you can't make sense of the world that you see around you. And then H for history. We obviously don't do a good enough job of history education, so we can do STEM all day long, and we can end up 20 years from now with lots of folks who can code, right? And lots of folks that can create all kinds of new technological gadgetry to make our lives easier and maybe enrich us in a number of ways. But are we going to have enough civics education? Are we going to have enough ethical, sociological, and historical grounding, and enough media literacy to actually function as a pluralistic democracy? That's an open question. That's a question to which we don't have an answer yet. And that's going to really be up to those of you in this room and your peers who are in school, and your children and your friends, because at the end of the day, if we don't figure this out pretty quick, we're going to run out of time to figure it out. We are looking at, maybe another 20 years approximately until this country, and it could be a little bit less, could be a little bit more, but roughly 20 years until this country's roughly half people of color and half white. If we don't figure out a way, and by the way, no wall is going to stop that, no immigration policy change is going to stop that, because that fact isn't driven by immigration. There's been a net outflow of migrants in the last 10 years rather than an influx, contrary to popular belief, and yet the demographics continue to change. It's mostly because white folks are on average about 12 years older than other racial and ethnic groups, and if your median age is 44, you ain't having a lot of babies. That's the thing, right? So it's just a fertility rate issue. It's just a birth rate issue. So the demographics are going to change. Nothing is going to stop that. The question is, are we going to prepare for that by taking seriously our obligations to create equity in housing, in employment, in schools, in the justice system? We can act like it's not our concern, and then we can wait around 20 years and we get to a point where half the population are people of color, and I can assure you that if we haven't figured out a way to really equalize opportunity, this country's not going to function for any of us, right? It's not just going to not function for black and brown folks, it's going to not function for white families either, and then we're all going to pay the price for that. So I appreciate you all coming out tonight and thinking seriously about this, and I want you to, just sort of remember, it's not about coming up with an answer right now. I think sometimes we come to these events or you learn about these things in class, and there's a tendency to want the 1, 2, 3, what's the plan, right, to solve the problem. There is no plan to solve the problem. And if there was, this 51-year-old white guy is not the one who's going to have it, right? People of color have been trying to find the answer to racial inequity for hundreds of years, and if they haven't found it, it's pretty unlikely that I've stumbled upon it. That's an answer that we're going to have to create together, right? When folks in this city and other cities around the South figured out the code for cracking the back of overt white supremacy and segregation, it was because they got into church basements and they spent 8 and 10 hours in hot, un-air-conditioned basements hammering out plans, right, in the early 1960s. And a lot of those people were 18 years old and 19 years old and 20 years old and 21 years old. They were young folks, and they were the ones who came up with a lot of the solutions that we now sort of take for granted as having moved the country forward. The same is going to be true throughout the 21st century. It's going to be up to young people, whether we're talking about the issue of race and racial inequity, economic inequity, healthcare inequity, climate change and ecological catastrophe, all of the issues that confront us. It's going to be up to young people to figure out answers. So don't look to experts, don't look to talking heads. We can help sort of frame the issue, right? And we can sort of diagnose the problem the way that a mechanic might diagnose the problem on your car, but ultimately you have to figure out how to fix the car. And in this case, you have to be part of the solution to that problem, even if it, requires the loss of sleep and it requires giving up some time, some really valuable time in your lives where I know you got lots of other things on your mind to try to figure out how you're going to get together with other people and make sense of this thing before we run out of time. I appreciate you all so much for coming out. I'll take any questions that you have. And again, thank you to Bryson and everybody for making this possible. Thanks again. Thanks. So if you have any questions, I'll take a few of them and then let folks get out. Thank you for coming. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
In terms of fulfilling this obligation, what do you think of the possibility of reparations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good conversation about reparations in a way that's at a much more sort of high level than it has been for a long time. Obviously, the sort of conversation about reparations has been in existence since the end of enslavement and really even during the period of enslavement. Many years ago, in fact, when my youngest was born, I was literally on the way to the hospital and I finished up an essay for a book on reparations that was coming out that next year. And so this was, 16 years ago. And I remember at the time when I wrote the piece that I wrote, and the piece that I wrote, it's in a book called Should America Pay? And it's a collection of essays on reparations, some in favor, some not, mostly in favor. And the piece that I wrote was making the argument that white Americans should support reparations, not just for the economic justice aspect of it, but even for what it would allow us to do, which is to confront the ugliness of our past and gain some liberation from it also. Because I think we're trapped in this history. James Baldwin said that these innocent people, by which he was referring to white folks, said these innocent people are trapped in a history they don't understand, and until they understand it, they can't be released from it. And what he was suggesting was until we confront honestly our past and try to do something about it, we're going to be constantly afraid of the other. We're going to be constantly fighting over these issues. So my point was, I think that by coming clean and by having this conversation about reparations, it can actually be liberating for white folks. But I knew when I wrote that piece, it was like screaming into the wind, because in '03 nobody was talking about that hardly at all. The guy that edited this volume, had a hell of a time even convincing the publisher that it would be worthwhile to do. Right around that same time, Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, came out, and it was the first sort of polemic in favor of reparations. But even Robinson said, he was the head of Trans-Africa for many years and did a lot of anti-apartheid work around South African apartheid, ended up leaving the United States a few years later and moving to St. Kitts with his wife, who was had citizenship there, and said when he wrote The Debt, arguing for reparations, he even made the point, I don't know that this will ever happen. In fact, he said, I sort of suspect it won't happen, but there's value in simply having the conversation. And here we are, 16 years later, and you have presidential candidates who are actually being asked about this in the Democratic primary. Now, none of them have taken, except for Marianne Williamson, none of them have really taken an unapologetic position in support of reparations, but just the fact that the conversation is being had, I think, is valuable, because it means that we're getting closer to some type of historical reckoning. Now, what would reparations look like? I don't know, and I don't claim to know. I happen to favor some form of systemic repair, because I think racism and white supremacy were systemic injuries. So the idea of just cutting checks to individuals, to me, seems inadequate. To me, that seems like cheap justice, right? It's like, here's your check and now we're sort of done. Plus, I don't think that politically is likely to ever happen in this country, certainly not anytime soon. But systemic reparation is something that can be done. Systemic investment in communities that have been robbed of resources can be done, and we've done it before. I mean, we paid versions of reparations, obviously, to those that were interned in World War II, Japanese Americans. Other countries have paid reparations to Holocaust survivors, for instance. Germany certainly has done that. And And we know from our own past, I mean, if you think about the United States, after World War II, we literally paid to rebuild our enemies, right? I mean, we spent billions of dollars in current dollars to rebuild countries that we had literally been at war with, as well as others throughout Europe. We spent a huge amount of money within Marshall Plan programs. We spent a huge amount of money to build that white middle class with the FHA underwriting low interest loans, with the VA loans, with other government programs in the New Deal that were racially very limited for whites. So if we could spend all that money, right, to create opportunity for people who, in the case of those white folks, were not being directly marginalized because they were white, it was in spite of being white, they were poor, then surely we could do something similar for those who have been marginalized by racism and white supremacy. How we do that, that's something we're going to have to discuss and debate, and obviously a lot of folks will have disagreements about it. What I think is interesting is when you look at the polling, right, where obviously only a very small percentage of white Americans say they're in favor of reparations, but what's interesting is that about 58%, I think in the last Pew Research survey that I saw, about 58, right around 60% of white Americans agreed that the legacy of slavery still has had some measurable impact on the black community, right? Now, only about, I think, of that 58%, I think 30% says a significant impact, and the other 28% says some impact. But in other words, the majority, the clear majority of white folks admit that the legacy of enslavement continues to have effects, and yet only a very small percentage say they want to do anything about that. That seems odd to me, right? If you're going to admit that the legacy of slavery has an inertia effect in the present, I think it's only a matter of time before you ethically come to the realization, well, if that's true, you have to do something. We might not agree on what that is, but you got to do something. Otherwise, it's like saying, yeah, you sort of got screwed, but there's nothing we can do, so, right? And so I think I'm hopeful that as the polls continue to acknowledge some of this historical impact, that maybe people will start to put two and two together and think, maybe we need to have this conversation at a really deep level. We're obviously a long way from that, just like we're a long way from a lot of things I think we probably need to do policy-wise, but we're never going to get there if we don't talk about them. So the discussion itself is valuable, for sure. Other questions?
I come from a country where we had a genocide, we had a famine, which went as a result of genocide as well. We moved past that, and we never demanded reparations, but what we have demanded and continue to demand is truth and reconciliation. Mm-hmm. Most essentially the truth, because without the truth, there will be no reconciliation. So it seems to me rather cheap and an excuse and a bit of a distraction to see or to offer reparations without truth and reconciliation.
Right.
Perhaps it doesn't even be magnified because one person has to cue.
Right. I mean, there's a linear process that's very important to follow, and I think that the truth and reconciliation processes that have been in place in South Africa, for one, but also we've seen this in Rwanda, we've seen this in a number of places around the world. They're trying some version of this in Northern Ireland. They're doing this in a lot of places with differing effects, but all of it very critical as an important step that we tend to skip over. And it's interesting, right, because the United States would look at these other countries, and Germany has certainly confronted its history far more readily than we ever have. I mean, I find it fascinating that, you can't possibly graduate from schools in Germany and not have an understanding of the history of what your own country did vis-a-vis both the Jewish community in Europe, but also Romani and others and LGBTQ folks, because it's very much taught. What's interesting is in our country, again, so not committed to truth and reconciliation, and especially truth, that we end up spending a lot more time talking about what Germany did. Now, I'm Jewish. I get the importance of this lesson, like there's value, universal value in understanding the history of the European Holocaust. But it's interesting, right, that the United States, we had a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C. years before, decade and a half before we had a Museum of African American History and Culture. That's fascinating to me. Why? Because we resisted the latter, and there was enough support for the former that it was created, and it's right there just off the mall, and it took all of that time for us to just have an honest, museum, not even about genocide against African peoples, not about the cultural genocide of enslavement and the Middle Passage and all that, just about African American history. We didn't even want to do that. I remember many years ago, reading there was a story in the Tennessean, fascinating story about an educational program that was being crafted at I think it was the Office of Workforce Development. They were creating an adult education program for the state of Tennessee, and I guess it's like for people that are getting their GED. And it was a tolerance curriculum. And it was intended to teach tolerance, which, I've always sort of found that word to be a little weak, right? Because it's better than intolerance, but it doesn't really get you where you need to go, right? I can tolerate you and not necessarily actually create equity with you. But, at least it was something. And so I'm reading about the program, and they were talking about, they're going to teach tolerance by encouraging the students. Now, keep in mind, most of these students getting their GED disproportionately were folks of color. They were disproportionately low-income, working class, and poor. A lot of them were immigrants. A lot of them were single moms. And so they have experience with discrimination. They have experience with intolerance. They have experience with being judged harshly. But instead of talking about their own experiences, or instead of talking about the history of injustice in our country, the entire curriculum was about how average, ordinary Germans didn't speak up. And what does that mean? That they were bystanders. But it's like, they literally drew this curriculum up 15 minutes drive from Andrew Jackson's house, right? Like 15 minutes away from the Hermitage. You could just go and sit out under the oak trees or whatever that is on his, plantation, and you could study, intolerance and injustice close up historically, but we would rather talk about that somewhere else. And so truth and reconciliation, and I agree with you, truth being the key word, is something we've yet to really do, and in fact we run from it. And if you think about the New York Times, 3 months ago did the 1619 Project, right? So is this scholarly compendium of articles written by historians and sociologists and others looking at the history and the legacy of this 400 years now since the arrival of the first enslaved persons at Jamestown. And the immediate reaction from certain people was, this isn't true. Well, it is true. I mean, these are historians writing this. These are not just people that, fell out of bed and had an opinion. So it is accurate. Secondly, people were saying, well, it might be true, but, other countries had slaves. Okay, but this is our country. We got to deal with our legacy. I mean, that's not really an excuse, right? The fact that other countries have done horrible things. It's like when you're a kid and you're playing ball and you break a window. You don't get out of trouble by telling your mom, well, Billy was playing too and also broke the window. Mom didn't care about Billy, and I don't care about the fact that other countries have done unjust things. As an American, I got to deal with my own stuff. Got to clean up my backyard, right? And so you had this entire history project, 1619 Project, lambasted for doing what? For basically, in the words of some, besmirching the history of the United States. But it's not besmirching the history, it's telling the story. It's not political correctness, it's historical correctness. It's scholarly correctness. And if we can't do that, right, we're behind where all these other countries are that we like to compare ourselves to, that have done some version of truth and reconciliation. South Africa, Rwanda, Northern Ireland, Germany, Australia, others that have done this, right, to one degree or another, and we're sort of sitting back resisting it. So it's incredibly untoward and hurtful, and I agree with you that if we're going to get to any type of real reparative policy, the truth is critical. Because if I don't know why I'm doing it, if I don't know why I'm supporting it, then it's going to be politically fraught. And I think one of the mistakes I'm not going to say a mistake, it's not a mistake, but one of the problems with the way that the civil rights movement was luckily able, it was fortunate to be able to get victories as relatively quickly as it did once it sort of hit its stride. But the problem was, once it won those victories, there wasn't this sort of concomitant follow-up with people to make sure everyone understood why this had to be done. It was just sort of assumed everybody knows. Everybody sees the grandeur of the civil rights movement. Everybody sees the value of it, but they didn't. And so what was interesting was you had people, if they grew up in that era, who maybe understood it, right? But then you have people, you get 20 years out, you get 40 years out, and people who didn't experience that time period, who don't have that frame of reference, and who maybe haven't studied the history, look back and they don't really see the importance of it. And I know growing up here in Nashville, one of the things that I found always so disturbing was, we took field trips all the time, right, at Hillsborough. We would take field trips and we'd go downtown, we'd go to the War Memorial Building, we'd go to the Capitol, we'd go to Legislative Plaza. We'd go to all these historic sites, we'd go to, the Hermitage. And at no point did we go to the site of the sit-ins. And at no point did we really learn the history of the movement. Now, I had parents that made sure I knew, right, which helped me. But if you didn't have those parents, and most people didn't, you could easily graduate from school in this town. And now, granted, that's the mid-'80s, but a couple years ago I was given the orientation speech at TSU for their freshman class. And here's a, historically black college, university, a large number of the kids went to Metro Nashville Public Schools, and I told this story, right, about not going to the site of the sit-ins and not learning really anything about the Nashville movement and how crazy that was. And these kids were coming up to me, this is 2012 or 2013, and they're saying, we're still not learning that. We're still not going there and talking about that. We're still not being taught that material in any real way, right? So that tells you a lot about how far we have to go to actually just lay some basic groundwork for us to even be able to talk about reparations, and I hope we'll do that soon, because that piece is indispensable. And if we skip over it, then we're going to have a hard time, I think, moving forward on any kind of public policy agenda for justice, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Given that the student body has no real understanding or grasp of any real
yeah.
lives and
Yeah, I think it is potentially dangerous, because I think, well, it's also just a shame, right, to not take advantage of the history that's all around you, and to really, there are a lot of people in this community in and around Nashville who very much remember that struggle and are part of that struggle, who could be, they're organic intellectuals within the community. Some of them will, be highly formally educated. Some of them will just be community folks that are activists and have been activists for 50 years, but they've got a lot that they can teach us. And so we ought to, number one, we ought to be tapping into that wisdom and that source of knowledge, and we just don't do that enough, which is our loss as students, right? Secondly, I think it's dangerous because what we end up doing is we end up turning people out in the world who we proclaim to be competent. Here you go to one of the best schools in the country. My kids go to USN, one of the best schools in the country. Kids that are going to Harpeth Hall and Ensworth and Hume Fogg and MLK, and they're all ranked up here really highly, right, as these amazing schools. And yet, and there are a lot of schools that aren't ranked super high, but they're also fantastic schools. And yet, what is competence, right? We can turn out young people and they can get into fantastic colleges. They can get really good test scores. They can get 5s on AP tests. They can go on and get PhDs and law degrees and business degrees, and they can do amazing things. But if you're coming out without a sense of this history and without a connection to that history, how competent are you really? You might be competent in whatever job you want to do. You might end up being a really good doctor or a really good lawyer or a really good whatever we're going to be in this world. But there's something missing. And I think to be honest, if you're going to be a truly fantastic whatever it is, lawyer, doctor, social worker, business owner, teacher, clergy person, whatever it is you're going to be, I think it actually requires you to have some knowledge about this stuff. Because think about it, if you're going to be a physician, right, just as one example, providing equitable care to all patients is something that's a lot harder to do if you don't have some knowledge about the interactions historically between the healthcare provision system and black and brown communities. Because that history is way different than the history of healthcare provision for white communities. There's a history of mistrust. There's a history of abuse on the part of physicians and scientists with regard to the black community. There's a history of black and brown folks being mistreated substantially by physicians. So therefore, a lot of black and brown folks don't trust doctors, particularly if they're white doctors, so they won't open up about their symptoms. They're not going to tell doctors what's going on with them because they don't think they're going to get quality care. If that happens, that they're going to get sicker because the doctor can't help them. So the trust relationship that needs to exist between a doctor and their patient, between a business owner and their employees, between a teacher and their students, between a social worker and their clients, between a cop and the people that they patrol on the street. Any job you think of, pretty much, is going to be harder to do equitably in in a society where it's going to be 50-50 white and people of color. You've got to have those skills. It's going to be harder to do any of those jobs if we don't have some grounding in this history. And what I think is interesting is when law enforcement and when physicians and when lawyers going through law school, not lawyers yet, but people going through law school to become lawyers, are actually exposed to this, there is some evidence that suggests they do better in their jobs at treating everyone equitably. There are some medical schools, for instance, that have integrated some training on subconscious bias and unconscious bias in healthcare for their physicians in training, so that when they become full-scale physicians and full-fledged licensed practitioners, they'll have some sense of what it is they're doing in communities that maybe are different from their own. So I think we're actually shortchanging young people a lot and minimizing their effectiveness as adults and whatever profession they're going to have if we don't deal with these difficult subjects. We're not doing anybody any favors, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah? Okay, well, I appreciate y'all coming out. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the night. Appreciate you.